Welcome to the March 30th, 2025 episode of the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop. And today's working title, you know what? I don't have a working title. We're going to talk about the polling collapse of the Conservative Party of Canada's election campaign. There's all sorts of media stories about infighting, and it looks like the Liberals have now caught the Conservatives. And one of my favorite pollsters, we're going to talk to him, is Frank Graves of EKOS Research. So welcome to the interview, Frank.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, you started calling this decline of the Conservative public support way back in January, long before some of the other pollsters cottoned onto it. Explain why that is.
Well, first of all, we are sampling in larger numbers and have been than most of my colleagues in the industry since in the last several months. We have built up, and part of our services is during elections to provide clients with a tracking system, which we call the Intelligent Voter Information System, which has, based on large numbers of cases, like we're unlike some of my competitors, I'm sampling 300 or 400 cases a night at this time and have been doing that for some time. So first of all, we're seeing things that are much more recent. And if you come into a period where change is accelerating, you're not going to pick that up if you're tracking with, say, 1,000 cases over a month. You'll have a lag, and that echo will distort your results. The second problem is I think a lot of the polling today for financial reasons and others is based on methodologies which are called opt-in online or self-selected. And they're fine in gross terms, but they don't have the same level of scientific accuracy or agility, in my opinion. Everything we do is done from random probability selection, where we go from a known frame of every member of the population, and then we talk to them with a known non-zero chance of them appearing. We also, in our probability panel, we have confirmed the identity. And you think, oh, well, why would you do that? Because there's a whole pile of these respondents who aren't even people anymore. They're bots and click forums from China and so forth. So all of that coalesces to, I think, explain some of the differences. But yeah, we started seeing something really significant going on in mid-January, which we reported on. This was following Mr. Trudeau's announced resignation, which was one of the key barriers to a Liberal recovery. It was not dramatic. It was significant, but a fairly tepid movement back. And then by the following couple of weeks, it accelerated quite dramatically, such that by the end of January, we had seen the 25-point lead. And remember, using the same methodology, at the end of the year, we had found that Liberals at an all-time low of 19 points, at least in the 20th century, and the Conservatives at an almost all-time high of 45 points. So our methodology was showing the same thing as everybody else. It's just that when the changes started happening, we registered them more rapidly. So by the end of January, that 25-point lead had basically been extinguished.
Now, there are a number of reasons that are being advanced for why the Conservatives are in free fall in terms of public opinion polling. So let's talk about several of them. What role has U.S. President Donald Trump's threats against Canada, annexation, becoming the 51st state, economic pressure, tariffs, what role has that played?
Well, I will talk to that, but first, there's really been four key factors which have produced this incredible transformation. I've never seen anything like this in a very long career. So we've gone from a 25-point lead. In our polling, we now have the Conservatives down at least 10, maybe 11 points. So that's unprecedented. As I mentioned, the first thing was Mr. Trudeau's resignation allowed some voters to think, okay, we're not voting for him because of antipathy for Mr. Trudeau, so maybe we can return. The second was Mr. Carney's coming out party on the Daily Show and elsewhere had a fairly significant amount of positive buzz. Oh, he's not this boring technocrat. And so that was the second factor. But the third is one you just mentioned, which is by far the most important. When we ask Canadians, do you think what Donald Trump is doing in the States is sort of what you expected, or is it better or much worse? And look, the yardstick wasn't very high to begin with, but people said, oh no, we knew it was going to be bad, but we didn't think it was going to be this bad. Talking about tariffs, the end of mercantilism and a return to protectionism, annexing Canada. And then on top of that, we're going to make the Gaza, a hotel area. We're going to give Russia parts of the Ukraine. Well, we're really discussing it with them. We have a guy in charge of health who's like a vaccine. I mean, it was just this panoply of cavalcade of things which were so upsetting and concerning, particularly to what I would call the large open portion of Canadian society, those people who are relatively well-informed, institutionally trusting, and that group who've been in a state of relative despair, not kind of engaged in politics, suddenly said, oh, wait. And what we saw, probably the principal engine driving all this, was a recovery of what had been moribund levels of attachment to country. Attachment to country in Canada, which I have tracked for 35 years, was at a historical nadir. It was incredibly low, and it was even lower amongst under 35 Canada. All of a sudden, with the threat of annexation and all these other things, and I think it was the spectacle of this type of populism that was driving this in the United States, we saw the attachment to Canada going up dramatically, and it has gone up each time we've looked at it. And what this did is it siphoned off all of those voters who were concerned and attached to Canada increasingly in big numbers, and they came from the NDP, they came from the Green Party. Surprisingly, some came from the Bloc Québécois, and a fair number came from what I would call status quo or progressive conservatives or lapsed liberals who had moved to the conservatives. Because the conservative base, 25% of those voters, of all voters, are ordered outlook, extremely angry, mistrustful, disinformed. They like Mr. Trump. The approval of Mr. Trump in that group and in conservatives in general is not a little higher. It's 25 times higher than it is for liberals or NDP or other voters. So this propelled this massive siphoning, all of this. We'll see where it goes from here, but it is the key engine that drove this and continues to drive this.
I'm going to ask you about the fourth driver of these numbers, and I have to wonder, is it the performance of CPC leader Pierre Poilievre and the campaign that they're running?
Yeah, that's astute of you to ask, because yes, that is the fourth factor. And Mr. Poilievre, who had run a very disciplined and effective campaign for the last 2 years, which had propelled him to this massive lead. I mean, I personally, like most 82% of Canadians, at the beginning of the year said he's going to win, and most of them thought he'd win a majority, and I would have agreed with them. I thought these guys can just, cut the engine, sip beer, and they're going to get their majority with a Bloc opposition. That's what would have happened. Because the other story is the Bloc were at 40 points at this point, and they've also seen a precipitous decline. So Mr. Poilievre, who's had a very successful framing, Canada's broken, Trudeau's bad, axe the tax, and, and carbon tax bad. Well, and he repeated this with, repeated simplicity and emotional engagement, and it propelled him. First of all, it's difficult to abandon something which has been so successful, but the second thing is, beyond just the ability to show agility and switch to what are new salient questions, nobody really cared about those things much anymore. He also was encumbered by the fact that he had this huge alternate outlook amongst his core constituency. Well, I don't think annexation is that bad, and I'm certainly not that worried about tariffs. Mr. Trump seems like a pretty good guy. All these sorts of things, which would be seen as anathema for the majority of Canadians, were actually pretty firmly ensconced in his. And so he had that kind of tension, and it made it difficult, and continues to make it difficult for him to represent himself as Captain Canada, or, I don't like Trump, and so on. Anyway, there you go. So that's the fourth factor.
Well, because we do a lot of work in energy, and that obviously brings up Alberta and Premier Danielle Smith, who is head of the United Conservative Party, and very much, I think, connected to Pierre Poilievre in the public's mind. She gave an interview to Breitbart News a week or so ago.
Yeah, familiar with that.
And basically said that. Well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, that Pierre Poilievre is very much like Mr. Trump. They would share the same kind of values. And secondly, that she had reached out to the Trump administration to see if they would pause the tariffs because they were benefiting the Liberals, which most Canadians saw as gross interference in the election campaign. So what effect has Smith's interventions had on Poilievre's campaign?
Well, there's two, when I mentioned his constituent, the other two challenges Mr. Poilievre has, he's caught between the two most senior conservative premiers, Mr. Ford, who has effectively contested Mr. Trump in vigorous terms, which is what most Canadians want. And Danielle Smith, who said, no, maybe we should be a little more compliant, maybe perhaps not obsequious isn't the right term, but, this was really offside with where most Canadians are on this issue. So it perverted even further difficulties. And it appears, certainly from some of the scuttlebutt from insiders, but even from Mr. Ford's demeanor, he's not particularly keen on tying himself to Mr. Poilievre, who may be like an albatross at this point on conservative fortunes. The direct impact of Danielle Smith on the sort of overall voter landscape in Canada is pretty trivial, to be blunt. It's not something people are aware of it, but there's bigger issues at play. And I don't think this is helping Mr. Poilievre in any way. But it's more to note that even though Mr. Poilievre is experiencing profound difficulties, he's still running ahead of where, for example, O'Toole was in the last election. And this is now, he's caught in a product where basically all of the center-left vote has bled hammers to the Conservative. The NDP, by the way, at the time where we had this 25-point lead for the Conservatives, they were tied with the Liberals. They're now at 7 points, and the Liberals are at 45 points. That's astonishing. And the same kind of thing going on with the Bloc. So, yeah, there's a lot of moving parts here, but none of them are really working out very well for Mr. Poilievre at this moment.
Yeah, I've been around for a little while, and I always remember the NDP polling about 18 to 20%. That seemed historically, that's generally where they come in, a little lower, maybe a little higher occasionally. But 7% is essentially a collapse of their vote, is it not?
Oh, yeah. And it's, I would say, the biggest threats to the Liberals right now, and I don't see a huge inventory of threats right now, but things can change, is if the NDP and Bloc were to recover. And I think that's actually more likely than a Conservative recovery. The Conservatives, by the way, they still have a sizable fraction of the voter base. And in fact, if the NDP and Bloc were higher, they'd probably be quite competitive. This and the Green Party is another story. The Green Party are at like 2 points. I mean, they're typically more like 5 or 6. So all of those factors have coalesced. And I think one of the areas that perhaps Mr. Carney has to be cautious is that he doesn't go too far. It seems to me that he's, shrewdly trying to reconstitute a big red tent, which includes a place for progressive conservatives and for progressives. And he's been successful, but there are some tensions in that as well. One of them might well be this issue of pipelines. We found, and I haven't put this out yet, but I do have the data, it's very clear. There's been a very sharp rise in the support for an east-west pipeline. And this is specifically tethered to the notion that if the Americans, first of all, if the Americans are going to punish us, let's deprive them of our energy, but we got to have something to do with it. So we'll need to create maybe refineries in Canada. We'll also need to have an east-west pipeline so that we can have another place to market this, perhaps to Europe, where we've seen a huge rise in the interest in closer ties with Europe. It's gone from almost non-existent to 70% of Canadians say, gee, I think we should join the European Union, let alone ANZA. So this has really just produced a very different outlook on issues like pipelines and energy as well.
I have to weigh in here because this is actually my bailiwick.
Yeah, I know.
So a 2018 study from IHS Markit, which is pretty and still applies according to the authors, Kevin Byrne, energy economist, there is no economic case for any new refinery or upgrader in Canada. It just doesn't exist. So that's out. And Mr. Poilievre has talked about we're going to build a pipeline to the East Coast, and then we're going to export our oil to Europe. The only oil we have to export is ultra heavy sour crude from the Alberta oil sands, and Europe has only 7% of the heavy crude refining capacity in the world. It's like 70,000 barrels a year. There's no demand in Europe for Alberta's oil. So once you get into the math behind these assumptions, I understand that the public perception of them is one thing. The math behind them is entirely different.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm really glad you said that, because my very sort of thin understanding of this would have been of the same conclusions of what you just said. And I think on reflection, Canadians probably will come to a similar conclusion, and that this is driven more by a desire, a visceral fear of how do we fortify ourselves against this threat of tariffs and annexation. There are things which are higher on the list of receptivity, which include big national projects such as refurbishing a hydroelectric corridor, which is a massive project, probably a $2 trillion ticket, and we won't get to a 2035 net zero economy or EVs without doing that. There's also support, very high support for high-speed rail, and hey, maybe you've got all this aluminum and steel we're not going to be able to use. And actually, I've tested that's extraordinarily resident. And there's other ideas too, like a Marshall Plan on housing that would see governments once again becoming landlords and builders, as we were very successfully after the Second World War and right up until the mid-70s. So yeah, there's a lot of interest, and I don't think it's been critically scrutinized. So I'm kind of of the view that you're right on this. And when the public, and we can't do all those things, by the way, these things are huge ticket items. So I think there'll be a little more selectivity. But I do think the idea of big national projects, both to advance progress on jobs and growth, but also to recreate a sense of country, because we have created our sense of country from what Richard Gwynne called state nationalism, a dialogue between citizens and the state, and big projects like the original railroad, CBC, Medicare, you name it. So I think this might be attractive for that reason, and also moving some of the benefits for dealing with climate change into our own backyard, because I think that's part of the problem with the appearance of the carbon tax. So how does that work? And I feel bad that some island's going to go underwater in the Pacific. But like, if you're going to tell me we can make, clear, dramatic progress in our own backyard while creating tons of great jobs and spin-off benefits, that to me is very resonant. So I hope that that's where they settle.
Well, let's talk about that for a while. I don't know if your data addresses this, so I'll just ask the question. It seems to me that there is growing Canadian support for this idea of re-engineering the national economy on an east-west basis. So we remove the barriers to internal trade. That'd be part of it. And also we build out the infrastructure so that we can export more, we can add value to our raw materials, like oil and gas and timber and grains and all of those kinds of things, add value to them, and then expand our port systems so that we can export out to Asia and Europe. And that's a very different economy than being deeply integrated with the US. Does your polling data support that?
Emphatically, yes. A couple of observations. First of all, when I ask Canadians, I'm in the field on this right now, but I'll share the preliminary results. Do you think that this break with the United States or these difficulties are something which will repair themselves after Donald Trump leaves, or is this something that is going to be permanent? A vast majority believe it's permanent, okay? And there's all kinds of other ancillary data that backs that up. 70% of Canadians tell us, I'm not going to the United States, I'm not buying product. And it's not just them lying in a survey, because we're seeing the objective data reinforce that. The huge increase in internal free trade, which is something which has been a great idea around for a long time, but I believe it'll actually happen now. That's the support for that's enormous. Kind of refashioning an east-west emphasis rather than north-south. I mean, Jim Stanford just came out with some recent data showing 80% of our economic activity occurs within Canada. It's not like which is a lot higher than it was at the close of the last century when it was 60%. So and I do think there's a lot more appetite for strengthening economic relations with Europe than there is with Southeast Asia, India, or China, because I've tested that. I think people are guarded about China and India right now. That may lapse, we'll see. But it really is a dramatically different thing when they look at, and I think also for ideas like ANZUC and, this kind of Australia, New Zealand, UK is also. So I think Canadians are looking for some really big changes, which will perhaps be painful in the short term, but will fortify us institutionally and economically to live in a world where we're not going to be so dependent on the United States.
Now, tomorrow on Monday, I'm going on the PBS program White House Chronicles with Llewellyn King, and they want me to explain Canada to their American audience. And one of the things I'm going to say is you don't understand, Americans don't understand the extent to which you have ruptured the relationship with Canada. We don't trust you anymore. You have betrayed us. And, it's almost like a betrayal within a marriage or within a family. It's like that. And Canadians now are tremendous support for moving away from you and building something different and less integration. And what you're talking about would seem to would bear that out. But what about Americans' concept of Canadians and what we're doing? Do they understand where we're at?
No, and I've done a lot of work on reciprocal attitudes within North America over the last 25 years, and they're quite different today than they have been. Americans have always had very favorable outlook on Canada, based on extremely low fluency about what Canada is. Canada's always that kind of weird cousin up in the attic. We like them, but I don't really know how they work. And Canadians also looked at Americans relatively positively, but though with this narcissism of difference that imagine we were profoundly different, where in fact, if you test the values, we aren't really that different from Americans. And I'm going to just go out and say, like, I personally do not, I think we're on this path. The idea that we will be permanently severing our relationship with the United States, to me is, I hope that isn't what happens. I hope we can design something that fortifies us from any kind of capricious new regimes that might emerge. But like, for example, our auto trade, I mean, that's one of the most, it's a remarkable success story. The average car goes across the border like 8 times in this value-added process. So I've asked Canadians, do you think we should build our own auto industry like they have in the UK or Italy or Germany? And they're going, yeah, sure. But you know what? That'll be a very painful process. I also find there's strong desire. They might be naive on the refinery thing, but I think they're thinking, why don't we build our own defense capacity in Canada? And defense, by the way, has skyrocketed. Over half of Canadians say they're not going to rule out the Americans might want to invade us. I think that's crazy, but who knows? It's a perception, and perception does drive around. Maybe it's more than a perception. So we're in some unprecedented times. And on that point, 3/4 of Canadians tell me that this election is the most important election in their lifetime. Sure. And I think what it's boiled down to is this fundamental values-driven contest for the future between this more open versus this more ordered way of designing your future. And I think Canadians are recoiling at the idea that ordered kind of populist, angry, mistrustful, pull up the drawbridge, turn back the clock. They're seeing that kind of exhibited in a very troubling way in the United States. And I also think that's one of the things that has damaged Mr. Pollster, because even if he wants to fashion himself now as a savior of Canada and a nationalist and all those things, it's clear in our research and others that he's tapped these sources very effectively, but in a way that's going to make it more difficult for him to be the champion of an open future.
How do Canadians feel about Mark Carney? This is very interesting because you mentioned earlier that they've discovered he's not a dry, boring technocrat. The man's actually got a little charm to him. I mean, he showed up at the Edmonton Oilers practice with his goalie skates on, and he took a turn around the rink because he was a Harvard backup goalie back in the day when he was going to school. So there's been a lot of scrutiny of Carney, and so far my perception is that he's withstood that. Not, he's had a few.
Oh no, he's done very well, and his net approval rating has twice the positives of Mr. Pollster, which is a formidable advantage. But more importantly, we will go through the key list of issues that are driving Canadians' concern. And by the way, number one is not affordability. That's a huge issue, but it's been a huge issue for some time. The new master issue is how are we going to deal with the United States, Mr. Trump, and trade. And he has a major advantage on that, as he does on issues like infrastructure, national projects, and even issues like fiscal balance and making the economy stronger, which are kind of almost pro forma advantages for the Conservatives typically. So yeah, he has done extraordinarily well. It doesn't mean that he's, they're out in the street going, Hosanna, here's our savior. But he's withstood all of the problems so far. And I expected to see him. We did see some kind of retracting of his lead in the first few days after the writ was dropped, but that's recovered. And by the way, that lead he has is sizable, but it understates the true magnitude of the seat efficiency. He leads now in British Columbia, a solid lead in Ontario, which is not going away, a surprisingly an even larger lead in Quebec, and he's leading in Ontario. So it seems to me by the time we get to Manitoba, he's probably already got his majority, unless something disrupts this. Events, dear boy. But we know at this stage, I don't really see a lot of, there's a lot of immediate challenges for him. Like I've been testing things like, well, what about, he was investing in the Bahamas or whatever. It's a minor exposure. In fact, the bigger exposure, which I've been testing, is why hasn't Mr. Poilievre got a security clearance, which is now coming up as a bigger issue. So, it's not like he's got an uncluttered path to victory, but it looks pretty good for him right now.
For my American viewers and international viewers, we should maybe explain that conservative support is concentrated to a greater degree in Saskatchewan and Alberta, which have about 6 million people in them. That's kind of Alberta's the Texas of Canada. They've got major oil and gas reserves, and that's where conservatism in Canada. It's the heartbeat of it, the spiritual home, if you will. But because they're so represented in Alberta and Saskatchewan, that then kind of skews the seat distribution for the Liberals. Correct?
Yeah, they could win all the seats twice with the numbers they have in Alberta and Saskatchewan, but they're only available once. So that becomes like inefficient. Although I have seen some interesting shifts in Alberta. Mr. Carney and the Liberals are doing okay, and I suspect they'll win more seats than the last time out, particularly in Edmonton and Calgary, because I've got them registering in around 30%, which is pretty high for Liberals.
And very high.
It's very high. So as they say, it will take a major disruption in the patterns, which now look like I don't say they're baked in, but they're not like some ephemeral movements which occurred overnight. All the movements I've seen, and you get this appearance from looking at the public polls that, there's a lot of, no, it's been like this. It's been a steady monotonic rise, followed by plateau, and then a slight dip, and now it's gone up again. So, but it looks statistically very well behaved. This is not something where I look at this and say, this could go anywhere tomorrow. It could, I suppose. We never know. The future doesn't always resemble the past, and predictions really hard, particularly about the future. But this is more and more looking quite auspicious for Mr. Carney and for the Liberals, which is remarkable given that they were completely out of the picture 2 months ago.
Yeah, I can think of a few elections that sort of pivoted on a central issue. And do you remember that interview between Brian Mulroney, the PC candidate or leader, and Turner?
Yeah, sure. That's the only debate in Canadian history where the debate has actually qualitatively altered the outcome. For those who say, let's just wait for the debate. Well, I'll watch the debate. And it can have an effect, but it is extraordinarily rare for it to shape the outcome. That was one of the few. And that was around, amongst other things, it was patronage, was also around the free trade debate. And remember, at that point in time, support for free trade and NAFTA in Canada was 30%. People forget. Last year, it was 70 or 80%. I suspect it's crumbled in the last month or two.
I would imagine. Let's close the interview with this question. Is it fair to say that the trends are in favor of Mark Carney and the Liberals, and essentially, unless there's some kind of cataclysmic failure on the part of Carney, that we're probably going to see a Liberal government, a majority government, on April 28th?
Oh, yeah, it would take something, quite massive to disrupt the current inertia that we are seeing, which seems to be increasingly, if not locked in, very stable. So, and that can happen. I mean, I don't think anyone would have predicted in January that you would have seen, the Conservatives relinquishing a 25-point lead and trailing back. So things can happen. But the range of things, if we look at the forces, and we talked about those at the outset, and I don't think those things are going to change that much. I don't think suddenly Mr. Trump is going to present himself as this moderate, rational guy who's, willing to be more collegial and so forth. He did a bit of that But I just don't think it's going to be. So no, I think this election is now Mr. Carney and the Liberals to lose. There are things that could cause that to happen, but right now they're on a path to a pretty clear majority government, which is something I and others would have found shocking 2 months ago.
Frank, always enjoy talking to you. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.